Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. I'm joined by Ian Wilcox. Ian and I go way, way back, and he's a fellow
We do.
Canadian, so we've connected on several levels. I won't sort of tell his story because I want him to tell it. But Ian has been deeply involved in the biopharma industry for 25, 30 years, as long as I've known him, as a consultant and as an investor. And he is just a wealth of knowledge, and it's just a privilege to have him join us today. How are you today, Ian?
Great, Dario. Thank you. Good morning. Good to see you.
Excellent, excellent. Let's just start by telling us about your background and your experience in the biopharma industry, Ian, especially maybe working with some of these early stage and emerging companies. I know you've worked across the space, but if you could just give us a bit of background.
Well, thanks, Dario. I have 25 years in the industry and began in consulting with the old Hague Group that was bought by Korn Ferry, where I ran the life sciences practice. And since that time, I worked subsequently for another firm well known in the life sciences space, ZS Associates, great firm that does a lot of work in building commercial models and a lot of other work. And then subsequent to that, I've been working in private equity and with a firm here in Philadelphia, near Ryan Healthcare Partners. And in that context, we focus on 505(b) smaller, when I say smaller, early stage companies that are developing assets. And we follow those companies through to a strategic exit. And in that context, we're looking at assets that are usually phase two, maybe phase three. And we've got a variety of assets that are de-risked. And when I say de-risked, are in a place clinically that where we as investors feel very good about the value proposition.
Awesome. So you've seen many biotech companies navigate the challenging path from clinical development to commercialization. What are some of the most common missteps that you see companies make when planning their commercial infrastructure?
Well, the first thing I would say is over planning. And when I say over planning, there's two ways to think about it. There's the perspective that you have as an executive coming in, and that is the bias to build infrastructure, right? And that's an interesting tension point. How much infrastructure do you need that's going to create value, and at what inflection points? So one of the issues that's on a tension point is you've got this asset. You're not sure at the end of the day that you're going to get the approval and the label that you want, but at the same time, you want to be ready. So that tension is very much to decide what is the scaling that you need. And baseline, clearly, you need medical, you need med affairs, you need to have a market access strategy, which is a reimbursement strategy. And you need obviously clinical data that differentiates your story. In other words, provides a differentiation story to say, here's this product, here's how it works, and here's how it's differentiated. So in terms of capabilities, the tension point is to decide captive cost, in other words, fixed cost versus variable. And I think it's very important to decide how you scale as you see the data points come through. In this industry, data coming from the study is inflection point. And you want to parallel, but not get too far ahead of the data as the data comes out. In other words, you get a great clinical picture. You do a phase 1B or a phase 2, then you need to do a phase 2B. You pace it as you look at and begin to hear and feel the data. You got a fully enrolled trial, you get a data readout, things are looking good. Also, you need to be looking at what your competitors are doing in the similar space. And I think it's really important to think through and constantly allow the model to have some agility, to have some flexibility in that. There's no question you need to scale. You need to build a commercial infrastructure. And you need to build it, but you need to, when I say commercial, I believe you start with the medical value proposition, what's out there, why use this product, and have the appropriate infrastructure to support that and get an early messaging to KOLs, key opinion leaders, and then build from there.
So what are maybe some specific examples, Ian, about where you see this infrastructure being overbuilt, some of the areas that maybe they're nice to haves, but not must haves at that particular point in the evolution of the company?
Well, I think there's a number of examples where companies have had to pull back.
Yeah.
And they've had to pull back for any number of reasons. One is, and there's a number of examples, obviously, in oncology, recently in cell and gene therapy, where essentially what's happened is the product, first and foremost, hasn't got the differentiation that it needs in the marketplace. It hasn't got the respective CPT or J code. That's all has to do with reimbursement. And I think the tension point there is you feel you want to signal to the market that you're ready, that you want to move forward. But at the same time, when you get the messaging from the market that actually you're not as competitive as you thought,
Mm,
or the uptake from prescribers isn't you would expect it to be, then
mm,
you end up having to pull back. And there's any number of companies that we can cite and talk about it directly, but that's the general theme, is that the overbuild, where you get into trouble, I think, is you haven't prepared the physician market, the prescriber market, the KOL market. When you lead with commercial talent rather than medical talent, you end up, I think, getting yourself ahead. And it's medical and reimbursement are the two capabilities, plus the data story, that
gotcha.
fundamentally secures your success, I believe.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Fascinating. So, with approximately 50% of biotechs trading at or below cash, what strategies should commercial leaders prioritize to build and launch capabilities while maintaining that financial discipline?
First and foremost, stage gate it.
Yep.
Okay. If you let's say you do a really successful raise, which in this environment, well, that's unless we're talking about perhaps a GLP-1
Yeah.
or maybe an area in immune such as CNS or Alzheimer's, but even that's a tricky space. But obviously, the one that everyone's talking about is a GLP-1 space, and that's starting to get pretty crowded, obviously. The so let's set aside what I think is a challenge, continues to be a challenging raise environment. And as you just said, trading at about 50%, 50% or below cash is really the question. You've got a stage gate and you've got to be really thoughtful about where you allocate and decide very thoughtfully. A number of clients of mine are reviewing infrastructure, internal infrastructure. A number of them are looking at, do we split off R from D, for example,
Mm,
and split off those companies in some way. Some of them are considering going private after they've been public, feeling that the valuations don't reflect. The market isn't able to value it. There's a number of strategic questions that the board and investors are having to grapple with as it relates to the valuation side and capital and how the market is valuing the company and the asset class as a whole. But I think the other piece, when you think of it from an operational perspective, is you got to stand back and say, how do I leverage my partners better? You
mm,
fundamentally get to a question of cash burn.
mhm.
How do I really focus on cash burn and what's critical? That constantly has to be reprioritized in a cash constrained, in a resource constrained environment. And this is what clients are doing consistently now. Is during COVID and 2 and 3 years ago, when the market was in a different place, you could do a raise. You could do the raise on the back of a phase one data concept. That's much more difficult now in most cases. And so what we're having to do now is to look at what's the range of my outsourced partners, again, going from variable to fixed. How do I ensure that I have a market access story
Mhm.
from the get-go, but the time I'm in phase two as a company? I need to be thinking about the CPT code, J code, whatever, CPT code, J code, the reimbursement landscape. Because that is where, from an investor viewpoint, I know that there's uptake. I know that there really is not only a total addressable market, there's also a propensity for this thing to get reasonable reimbursement, and it's differentiated accordingly.
Gotcha.
The other thing I think, just to add to that, is instead of building out a lot of commercial infrastructure at the sales level, and there's value to that in certain cases. The other is to consider the digital engagement model.
Mm,
And particularly when you're talking about early stage, like for example, in the dermatology space, even not only dermatology, but in spaces that are much more consumer driven, consumer centric, having a digital engagement model and what that
mm,
could look like is the app, that could look like social media strategies.
mhm.
Having a digital engagement strategy is one that again prepares the market. It usually can be less cost intensive than building a huge army and sales force
Sure.
around it.
Sure. Sure. Cool. So you had mentioned reimbursement. How should companies approach reimbursement? And at what stage of development should they begin to work on this?
First and foremost, there was an old adage in the industry that said no outcome, no income.
Yeah.
And that relates to health economic value proposition. You have to have an outcome story. And if you've got an outcome story that's compelling in terms of that value prop, the drug does X, Y, Z, and here's the data to support it. You go to the payers and you present what we a compelling dossier health economic story that says here's what this does in terms of reducing the burden of care, quality of life, so on and so forth, progression-free survival, like, for example, we talk about a lot in oncology. Having that data story, and it's a differentiated data story, differentiated from the competitor, having that story in hand and working on it at least at phase two is, I think, one of, if not the most important thing that you're doing to preserve and build essentially. It's another story about how you're building the asset. You've got this one story where you're taking something and you're curating it through a clinical development journey with patients and so on and doing trial recruitment. This other critical component that should be concurrent with trial work is curating the what I call the value story for that asset, which is the story that says, here's the great data, here's clinical outcome data, here's patient impact data. Whatever story we're talking about could include caregiver impact. The more we're able to tell that, we can sit down with a payer and say, here's what this looks like. Here's what the value proposition is. I mean, the GLP-1s are a great story. I mean, not only have we got a multifaceted clinical indication story here, are not only around weight, but around addiction and other related comorbidities that are still being explored. You begin to think about the overall, how that's reducing the overall cost of care.
Right.
Is huge.
Right.
Absolutely huge. So having that story in hand, I think, is really key. The other piece that companies, depending again on the asset class, is patient services platform. Arterial pulmonary hypertension is an example where that disease state, having anything in rare diseases, is another case where you need a patient services platform. Not only patient services, but a care RX. When I say RX, a platform that speaks not only to the patient, but to the caregiver, to the healthcare professional. Building that infrastructure or having a partner that does that for you, combined with a real strong data strategy, I think is an investment that's well worth it. Getting distracted with other, what I consider to be infrastructure capability, you're not ready for that until you really truly are in market.
Right.
And with the data story, with the reimbursement story, all in hand.
Could you share some examples of companies that have successfully implemented a right-sized commercial model, Ian, and what made their approach effective?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind on right-sized model is Amylin, and there for a drug, they built a highly specialized team of only about 50 reps, focusing on 1,500 neurologists for amyloidosis. The drug is Onpattro, and instead of doing a blanket strategy, what they did was they focused on narrow targeting using select 50 highly trained reps, deeply trained in understanding the clinical pathway and understanding the patient journey. And they were able to target those physicians, knowledge in hand, really the best reps that were well trained with very good clinical insight, good diagnostic skills in terms of engaging the physician and wrapping around that with an MSL strategy.
Yeah.
Instead of, again, going one size fits all, they took a very specific segment of the market of specialists, targeting it with meaningful conversations that were not push, but as much engagement strategy with the physician, helping the physician, dialoguing about the patient journey. That's been one that's been, I think, has been really thoughtful. And the notion here that I think is compelling, that a large pharma, and this is a smaller pharma, right? This is not a company that's huge. This is a mid-size. Well, I don't say mid-size. It's large, but it isn't the size of the Pfizers and the Mercks of the world. They were able to work cross-silo by bringing case manager, MSL, reimbursement, all of that in a integrated way under the auspices of this person who is functioning very much as the center point of dialogue with the HCP in the office. Doing that effectively in that integrated way has generated a lot of value for them and goodwill in the market in introducing this product successfully for them.
Great. It's a great story. You'd also mentioned before, Ian, digital and omnichannel strategies. I mean, they're often discussed about, extending reach.
Yeah.
How can companies implement these approaches without losing that personal touch that's crucial in healthcare? Almost kind of, it's a little bit counterintuitive given what you just described about myelin.
Yeah, I think if we go into the aesthetic space, which is much more direct to consumer,
Yeah.
you think about what Galderma has. They have Aspire, right? And as the patient, again, this is when I think of patient, I think even more consumer, right?
Mm.
That's a choice. That's a choice. It's not covered reimbursement, but the platform behind that of patient engagement or customer engagement, the seamless concept of the app and the app supporting and reminding me the points that you're building. It's much more of a direct to consumer play in that context, is one that I think is very effective in terms of doing consumer patient engagement, getting people to return, and has an important knock-on effect for the injector. The other space that's more clinically oriented that I think has been transformed in terms of treatment is type 2 diabetes.
Mm.
And that has gone from a space where, 10 years ago, there wasn't something you could put here
Yeah.
on your elbow, right?
Yeah.
There's any number of apps and processes that we now can monitor our type 2 diabetes and be our own agents in our care.
Right.
And that is a space that is becoming much more about the patient coming in, having their own data about their A1C, monitoring it regularly with an app, getting reminders,
Hmm.
and engaging much more as agents in their not only decision making about their health, but getting the feedback and making better lifestyle and food
Right.
choices.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think the A1C, the type 2 diabetes story, and the integration of technology apps in that has been a game changer for
Yeah,
a
it's
lot
getting
of
that
patients.
real-time feedback or near real-time feedback.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that's an asset class or therapeutic class again because it's lifestyle, and I would add into that the broader area of metabolic, which includes not only type 2 diabetes but high blood pressure
Yep.
is another one. We're seeing some of that work as well in ADHD is another class where again, we're using apps as a feedback to support the treatment. Is another one that is growing extensively. And again, what these apps do is they support essentially the patient care journey in different
Yep.
ways.
Yep. Yep. Fascinating. So, how should commercial leaders balance investor expectations for aggressive growth with the practical realities of building sustainable commercial operations?
I think the most important question in balancing that is thinking about three things. One is where are you in product life cycle? That's one. Are you going after market share? And is the expectation set that you're going to really double down and take market share? What is that strategy? So if you're going to take market share, how are you going to take that? Are you going to flex it on price, or you're going to build an infrastructure, a commercial infrastructure that's going to be part of messaging in that context? So I think you have to do two things. You have to decide your competitive positioning. Two, you have to decide from an investor, from a capital allocation perspective, what's the trade-off? If you're working in a high value, a low volume, a low value, a low value, let's say it's low
Yep.
value, high volume market,
Yep.
okay, that's essentially a generic space.
Right.
You're not going to spend a whole lot of commercial infrastructure to go after something where the price continues to do this.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're talking about a market like the GLP-1s currently, it's going to change in the next couple of years as more and more entrants come on board and we get to a generic introduction. That's a space where you have to, if you're going to allocate more dollars in commercial infrastructure, you have to have a compelling differentiation against the leaders.
Right.
And I think there you have to be very, very, very selective about that because you and I know that the basic law of supply and demand is going to be such that at some point there's going to be downward pressure on price as more
Right.
entrants come into the market. So
Right.
again, your question is, as a commercial leader, I need to be really careful not to get ahead of where payers are going to be.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what's going to hurt me is the gross to nets. And that is the distance between the price that I want to get and actually the discounts that I'm taking.
Right.
And so the more you're operating in a market that's highly competitive and not that differentiated, the more you're going to suffer from this pressure. And I think, again, commercial leaders are now challenged to decide, how much infrastructure do I really need?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's the question. What can I actually variabilize?
Right.
And that requires a different mindset. It requires a mindset that if I don't own it, can I still impact it?
Right.
How much do I trust my partners?
Right.
And I think one of the most important learnings for this industry, and as I think about the auto industry as being an industry that has a seamless value chain of partners,
Yeah.
and these partners come in and work in on the floor of a Ford or a
Yeah.
Stellantis. The pharma industry is beginning to evolve in that way.
Right.
Historically, wasn't. It was much more of a siloed way of approaching
Yeah.
things. But now I think the opportunity, particularly for the mid-sized players, is instead of building a lot of that infrastructure and having a lot of capital intensity on
Yeah.
the balance sheet, is to decide, how do I build the kind of partnerships, the ecosystem of partnerships that you and
Right.
I see in other industries like tech and auto, for example.
Right. Right. Makes total sense. Hey, Ian, so I know certainly, in your days at the Hay Group, you were, one of the world's renowned experts on talent in the pharma space and competencies. When you think about, I guess, scaling these commercial operations and maybe the temptation to recruit somebody from big pharma into one of these, what have you learned or what have you seen around, kind of picking the right person for the job? I mean, I don't want to stereotype and say that, someone who worked in big pharma can't do this, but certainly I'm sure that there are certain tendencies, right, that you're looking for when it comes to finding the right leader to do this.
Well, let me say a couple things. I think what has changed is this, just in general, that the industry, the pricing, the IRA, the pricing constructs that are out there make the world for a pharma leader, at least on the commercial side, a different reality.
Yeah.
So what's happening is the branded pharma space. Historically, you could always expect some level of price increase every year.
Yeah.
That's not the case anymore.
Right.
So the skill sets that I'm seeing change are, one is understanding how to fundamentally think about a business from a competitive cost perspective,
Yeah.
and having that focus. I mean, this is an industry that has very, very high gross margins historically.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah.
that's being challenged.
Yeah.
In any number, by any number of corners, in the payers, government, and so on. One of the things that clients are asking when they look at talent is to understand not only an enterprise perspective from these executives, but understanding, how does this person have an ability to think not only top line and growth and
Yeah.
volume, historic skill set, but how do I find someone who actually thinks about the total P&L, the total cost,
Right.
thinking of this from a profit preservation and cash perspective. So when you bring somebody into a smaller pharma that's launching one product and that may still not be cash flow positive, that person that's coming out of the larger pharma may or may not have had the experience of understanding resource constraint,
Yeah.
understanding quarter by quarter what the fundamental tensions are of talking about profitability and the goal that investors have of getting to that point. And the fact that you have to build a dynamic cost structure underneath of you. That skill set is a different skill set, I think. And it's a mindset of a continuous improvement. Again, coming back to, the notion of in manufacturing. That mindset, again, isn't one that I think we find historically, at least not in the commercial side of pharma. We clearly do in the manufacturing side. So I see that as a skill set that is one that employers, that particularly the mid-sized pharma players, are looking for more than they did even 5 and 7 years ago.
Right. Right. Wow. So this has been a fascinating interview, Ian. You've shared a lot. Just take a little bit of time here, and we'll summarize a few of the key takeaways But looking ahead, how do you see commercial models in biopharma evolving, especially again, as we've alluded to here, in whatever resource constrained companies? And are there emerging technologies that could fundamentally change how these companies go to market?
Well, clearly AI is going to play a huge part of that.
Yeah.
No question. That's just a general statement, and we're still figuring that out, right? So that's a very, I mean, everyone is talking about AI, but I think in pharma, we're seeing, for example, predictive targeting. We're seeing models that are built that help from the commercial model perspective build multiple patient phenotypes, not only patient phenotypes, prescriber phenotypes. We can look at that by zip code. I think the world of data and use of that in what we call the comm ops or the commercial operations side of the house in pharma is going to continue to grow. And that's going to be a capability that's going to be increasingly important. And I think we've only scratched the surface on that. I wouldn't even use the word AI because it's overused. I think it really is a broad set of analytic tools, predictive tools that will help us to increase the effectiveness of targeting and assessing what the ROI is from our efforts and our commercial infrastructure. And again, to come back to something that you asked previously, that's going to become a requirement, I think, is to say, how is that commercial structure really yielding a return for us
Right.
in a way and growing? I think that's going to be key. I think digital engagement is going to continue to grow, but it's going to be targeted. It's going to not just be apps. I think that the notion that we will be more accountable and continuing to be accountable for our care there in any number of areas of our lives, be it type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, heart, overall wellness. I think the industry is beginning to recognize that it's not pushing a product, but the solution that it's bringing is a
Right.
wellness solution.
Right.
And so you're seeing that evolve and change in terms of how we talk about a solution. I think the other thing that's clear is that the industry is having to sit down with payers and not simply say, okay, let's negotiate AWP, average wholesale price. Let's actually talk about the data and the outcome story that I have for my product.
Right.
Right? That's a different conversation than saying, let's just talk contracting,
Right.
which is historically the way we played the game.
Right. Right.
And I think that's good for everyone. That's
Right.
good overall in terms of the health and cost, taking cost out and talking about value
Right. Right.
in the
Right.
system.
Great. Well, once again, Ian, thank you so much. Unbelievable insight, and wish you all the best success going forward.
Thanks very much, Dario. Really appreciate it.